Thank you. Okay. Thank you. My name is Darshana Lina Campos. Me llamo Darshana Lina Campos. Yo puedo hablar en español, pero mi español es Spanglish, y por eso voy a hablar en inglés. First, I would like to thank all the people on the tech team for the support that they've offered me. I would also like to extend my appreciations to everybody who has organized this forum. It is such a pleasure for me to be here. I would also like to thank the Fulbright Commission in the United States, as well as in Colombia. If it weren't for your generous invitation, I would not be here. And I would especially like to thank my colleagues at Fundación Pro Antioquia, who've invited me to work with them. I'm thinking about how we can help Colombia in this momentous occasion transition into a peace that lasts not just 50 years, but at least 500 more. So with that, whoops. Okay. What I'm going to be doing today is offering you an introduction to who I am and the kind of work that I do as an educator. I'm also going to be speaking about a few different definitions that I use in my work as an educator. Ooh, now I have both microphones. Is it okay? I'm going to be sharing with you rather, a few different definitions: violence, trauma, and healing from an educational standpoint. I'm also going to be talking about a few different examples of the way in which trauma-informed education can work for educators, for school leaders, and then for people like us who work in various companies and organizations providing professional development. So again, my name is Darshan, and it really is my greatest pleasure to be here. I stand before you as the descendant of genocide survivors. Okay. Perdón. Yeah? Okay. Yay! Okay. One of the things about doing the kind of work that I do is you really have to have a big heart and really appreciate the changes that come before you. So thank you for everyone. Again, my name is Darshan, and I am the descendant of genocide survivors on both sides of my lineage. On my mother's side, her great-grandparents fled from Eastern Europe when their villages, their temples, and their businesses were burned to the ground. They came to the United States of America hoping to find a land of peace and opportunity for them. Within 30 years, though, they faced a lot of segregation, and then in their homeland, they saw the Holocaust erupt. It was a traumatic experience for all of them, including for my mother, who was born during World War II. Trauma erupted within that family in many ways. One of the ways in which it unfolded was in the form of incest, which my mother survived, as did her mother. On my father's side of the family were Puerto Rican. They fled the island of Puerto Rico when they were pushed off their lands and came to the United States in the early 1940s. It was during those same years, the early 1940s, when Puerto Rico was a target of forced birth control and sterilization campaigns. It is estimated that over 30% of Puerto Rican women were sterilized at that time. This is one way in which I can share my story, but there are others. I can also talk about the way in which I was born and raised in a community in the San Francisco Bay Area in California, a multiracial community, a community of incredible diversity. In the schools of my local community, there are more than 200 different languages that are spoken. I benefited from a wealth of experience and exposure to people from all over the world. My mentors, my teachers, have been Black. They have been Indigenous. They have been Asian. They have been Muslim. I can keep going. My mentors have also expressed other forms of human diversity, sexual diversity. My mentors and teachers have been gay. They have been queer. They have been straight, and they have been transgender. Like the experiences in my home life, in many respects, experiences that trained me to see the world through trauma, I was also exposed to the world through the lens of love, through the lens of healing, through the lens of community. As an educator, what I try to do is bring together the personal experiences such as those within my home life and my own ancestry with that of the community around me, because in many respects, we share very similar stories. As I mentioned, there are more than 200 different languages spoken in the homes of the local families in my community. There's a reason for that. Many of the people within my home community have fled to the United States. They have often fled genocide campaigns, some of which have been organized and pursued by the United States government. It is a very complex and a very real experience of diversity. Diversity of opportunity, diversity of violence, diversity of dreams. I start here by sharing these stories because in many respects we need to figure out ways to fold our personal traumas into our political traumas and think about what that means for us as educators. In 2006, I finished my PhD, and the focus of my dissertation was thinking about community education. What is the learning that we gain within our homes? What is the learning that we gain within our schools? What is the learning that we gain within our protests, within our offices, within our street festivals, within our museums, even within our professional spaces such as this conference? And the reason I've been looking at community education is precisely because there are so many people who come from communities like mine, communities of immigrants and refugees, indigenous peoples, and sexual minorities. So many of us are trying to figure out ways that we can make peace within our own lives. We're trying to figure out ways that we can teach peace, something that for many of us we have never known. In fact, I would say that none of us have ever known peace. None of us have ever known peace. We've had moments of it, but in so many respects, the worlds in which we lived are structured around violence. I look at violence from a systems perspective. And for this, I ask you if you could, please, place a hand to your heart, if you have one, and be attentive to your breath. Violence is not natural. Mothers suffer through childbirth for beautiful children. Children suffer bumps and bruises as they learn to walk. Elders suffer aches and pains. Violence is not natural. Violence is inflicted. Can you feel your heart? Your breath? I start here with this simple meditation because when we think about violence, it's not out there. We often carry it within us. Right now, I can tell you that my heart is racing, and it began to race more as I talked about violence, specifically the way in which it's inflicted. But in this moment, I'm also using a form of trauma-informed teaching. I asked you, if you could, to place a hand over your heart. Not all of us have hands. Some of us were born without a hand. Some of us lost a hand in a car accident. Some of us lost a hand due to war. There are so many landmines within our communities. Thank you. One thing I also want to say, not only is violence not natural, it's at once intimate and systemic. And what I mean by that, it is intimate in the sense that it unfolds within one person or between individuals, but it also is woven into our structures, our political structures, our economic structures, our school structures. I want to now give the example of rape, and I'm choosing rape for a reason. It is estimated that 1 in 5 women are raped. The United States actually has one of the highest incidents of reported rape. And it is also estimated that less than 50% of women who are raped talk about it. I have been raped. And it's something that I know has shaped the way in which I engage with my world, my intimate relationships, but also the political work that I do as an educator, especially working with communities like mine, communities of immigrants, indigenous people, and refugees. What I want you to take home from this idea that violence isn't natural is also the idea that violence is always public in nature. Even the forms of violence that we think are the most personal, incest or rape or stalking, actually have reverberations. Humans, we are social animals. We have intimate connections with the people that we meet. We share energy, we share ideas. In that sense, what seems to be so intimate is also always very, very public. This is the definition that I use of trauma. Trauma is how violence comes to live in the body. Psychologists say that trauma impacts our cognitive functioning, our emotional regulation. Neuroscientists say that trauma influences the way in which our neural pathways function and our entire nervous system. School psychologists say that when we think about trauma, we need to approach it from two main perspectives. We need to think about the ways in which we can repair our internal wounds, but also we can create a loving climate for people to come together in community, because ultimately, we don't heal alone, we heal together. In many respects, when we think about violence as being something that is inflicted, what we need to then sort of bring into being is other forms of connection, other ways of relating to one another. Epigenetics is a field of research that says that trauma is passed along through generations. Literally, we give it to a kid. We give it to our children. Many scientists, psychologists also say that there is no cure for trauma. I don't know about that. I would like to hold on to the belief that we can, if not cure trauma, we can find ways to heal. And for me, that is the centerpiece of what I do as an educator. So for me, what healing looks like is a sense of inner and outer peace in a moment that we can share with others. It honors us as we are, as we come into our rooms, our classrooms, our community spaces, our offices. And it also honors us for the kind of people that we wish to be as individuals and as a community. In this sense, healing then strengthens community. It binds us together. It creates for us another possible way of living in the world. For me, one of the centerpieces of thinking about trauma and thinking about healing is how can we actually channel our energies? If trauma is not something that can be cured, but it is something that we can understand and work with, how then do we work with it within the context of our classrooms, especially with our little ones who often do not have access to the kind of language that I have as an adult, or that my grandmother had without my education, but also as an adult? I want to now shift and talk about, a few different forms of trauma-informed education that I see making incredible differences in home communities like mine, communities of incredibly rich diversity, human diversity that to me is beautiful, a form of richness that we often underestimate. So one of the things that we know as educators, and I think most of us in this room know as people, is that when you're hungry, it's really hard to learn. It's really hard to concentrate. And we're focused on academic learning, which really is the centerpiece of my practice. How do we do that in a community that is hungry? So a garden school, an agricultural school, a farming school, what that does, it enables a community to actually meet its basic need, while at the same time having a theme around which you can organize every kind of academic learning that you wish. And it also does more. So in addition to giving us a way of understanding nutrition and science and the seasons, math, language arts, our ancestral pathways, the kind of plants that nourished our community, our ancestors in the past, the kind of plants that we have now through global migration, the seeds that we have brought with us into our new locations. One of the things that an agricultural school also does for trauma survivors, it gives us a way to actually release some of the trauma that we've experienced. We can literally plant it in the ground. We can find ways to work with our body and release it, sometimes in ways that we can't do through language. And really, when I'm working with trauma survivors, that's one thing I'm always trying to do, is understand how can we actually work with our bodies, a form of rich knowledge, and connect that to the other kinds of learning that we have, learnings within our heart, learnings within our brain, learnings that we gather in community spaces such as this. How can we actually connect to our earth and share learning and even release things that we don't need to carry with us any longer? In the context of the Bay Area, my home community, the San Francisco Bay Area in California, there's a reason why we have so many garden schools. And in fact, there are many across the United States. It's a growing movement right now, and it has been for a few decades. One of the reasons why we have so many garden schools is because hunger is so real. In the state of California, where I'm from, 1 in 4 children is hungry. In communities like mine, the number is 1 in 2. 1 in 2 children within my community is hungry. So if you create a garden school, you're actually enabling the people within my community to connect together, to connect to their brains, but also get their basic needs met. But it's more than that. I come from a community where many of us are farm workers, or the children of farm workers, or we're campesinos who have been pushed off our land and we're trying to make sense of an urban environment. For us, having a garden school is a way to honor our heritage and welcome that into the classroom. So in addition to having our basic needs met and giving trauma survivors a way to release some of the tension and the emotion that they carry into the earth, we're also welcoming in our ancestral legacies, our ancestral heritage. It's a way of honoring us for who we are, while we also become other people through the new kinds of learning that we're having. There's more than that, though. So many kids within communities like mine, especially communities with a lot of immigrants and refugees, were not raised by our parents. We're raised by an auntie, or we're raised in foster care. We don't have a parent to bring to the classroom. But what we can do when we have, for example, a garden school, is we can have a community celebration. We can have a harvest festival where the community comes together, where you not only bring your parents if you have them, but you also bring your foster parents, you bring your neighbors, you bring all the people around to participate in a child's learning, in a community's learning. In that sense, a garden school not only meets an individual trauma survivor's needs, but it also enables us to meet the needs of a whole community, not just for hunger, for food, but for living, honest connections to one another through something so simple as a celebration of food. I recently had the experience of visiting Caloto in Valle del Cauca. It was a beautiful experience for me. I was so, it was such an honor to be able to visit a number of schools in this region. And one of the schools that I visited was an agricultural school. This community was at the epicenter of so much of armed conflict. Most of the kids there have seen things that no one should ever see. What they have experienced, in many respects, it defies belief. And I think we need to hold on to that. Some of the things that we've experienced are really just horrifying. And that's honest. But in visiting the school, this garden school, I saw something so amazing. There was a pig farm, there was a bird farm, there were fruit trees and vegetable gardens, and there was a garden of medicinal plants. As I was led through these garden spaces, it was children in 4th grade, 10-year-olds, talking about what it is that they're doing, how they're caring for their chickens, how they're learning to inoculate them, how they're learning to care for a newborn baby, how they're tending a plant. And what was that plant's personality? That was something that many of these children said to me. The plant has a personality. You can't just touch it. You have to get to know it first. It was the sweetest thing to hear, the way in which they were being able to give life to themselves and their community, but also to the plants and animals around them. It was a gift of life that they were giving, I believe, to their ancestors, the people that they have lost, while also planting seeds for a richer future. So garden schools are just one way in which we can bring community knowledge into the classroom, into the community, and create healing from some of the horrors that we have experienced as survivors of trauma, such as war. I want to now speak to another form. Here, I'm talking about mindful schools, schools that practice meditation. And I'm actually not going to speak too much in detail because one of my colleagues is going to be speaking about that shortly. Thank you, Matthias, and the work of Respira, a Colombian organization that is also promoting mindfulness. I'd rather give him the podium for that. But what I do want to share is some of the work that I do as an educator is thinking about how to bring in meditation into the classroom. And the reason I do so is because there are ways in which meditation offers us a way of working with our heart and our brain. We actually become attentive to our emotions and our thought patterns. And this, for trauma survivors, especially students, is very important. One of the struggles that trauma survivors have is that we often time travel. Literally, we go back to times of trauma, or we propel ourselves into the future. How do we teach a child science if they're already living science fiction? How do we teach a child history if they're already living a historical horror, such as war? Mindfulness, meditation, gives children a way of grounding into their bodies, settling into their breath in the moment. But what it also brings, for educators like me, is it allows me to shift my focus from problems such as discipline or an emotional outburst and thinking more about how can I love my children, how can I teach my children, how can I support them. And this is a method that I have used not just with young people, but also with my college students. I want to share one example from something that happened to me a few years ago. I was working with a class, and we were talking about violence, trauma, and healing within our communities and what that looks like. And one of the books we were reading was about the experimentation on Black people who were made into slaves in the United States, as well as continuing medical experimentation on Black prisoners today. It was a difficult book for us to be reading and many difficult conversations for us to be having. This was a college classroom. Before class one day, one of my students came to me in tears. She couldn't handle the material. For all the ways in which I seek to bring in healing into the classroom, gameplay, teamwork, project-based learning, all those beautiful ways that educators think about creating a community in the classroom, it was too much for her. And the reason was simple. She looked at me and she said, "It's not only that I'm the only person in my family to be in college, I'm the only person in my family my age who isn't incarcerated." In that moment, all I could do was hold her hand and hold her eyes. But what I was able to do a couple minutes later, as we sat together in silence while she cried, was I restructured the classroom for that afternoon. As students came into the classroom, I said, "Pick up your bags. We're going outside." What I did that day is I took a technique of meditation to ground us. Literally, we went outside, and we sat on the ground, and I said, let's just be quiet for a few minutes and listen to what the world looks like when we're not in a classroom, when we're not in an institution, but we're somewhere else. And now let's think about what that means for those of us who are in institutions, such as our prisons, or our ancestors who were born and raised into institutions such as slavery. It was actually a beautiful class. It was probably one of the most memorable classes I've ever had, precisely because the honesty of the conversation was intense. And the reason it was so intense is we were grounded into the earth, making connection to one another, as well as something that could hold us up. Not just each other and the thoughts and the emotions, but literally the earth that could hold our trauma and allow us to channel and connect to one another in new ways. I want to now speak to another method of trauma-informed teaching that is becoming more and more popular across the United States, but also across the world, and that is restorative justice. As I started my talk, I spoke about how violence is always public in nature, how it's intimate and systemic. In fact, the example that I just gave of my student and the experiences of so many people within her family and her own as the first person in her family to go to school. Restorative justice is one of the ways in which we can help bridge the gap between our institutions. So restorative justice intervenes in the cycle of violence. Specifically, what it does is it helps correct or repair the violence that occurs between students in a classroom environment. But it also repairs the kind of violence that unfolds within our institutions, our schools, our prisons, our political structures. Specifically, how restorative justice works is it builds empathy between individuals, and it seeks to look at the harm that occurs within a community, not just between individuals, but literally how violence reverberates and has an impact. Often how restorative justice unfolds is by people coming together in a circle and sharing their experiences. I want to talk a little bit about what restorative justice has looked like in my local school district. And again, this is an urban district, primarily students of color, students who are Black, Indigenous, Asian. Many of them are migrants and refugees. In 2007, we were really struggling with the way in which our students and our families were experiencing violence, school-based violence. And we wanted to figure out ways that we could actually transform our schools into places of peace and healing. And that is when one school started to pilot a program in restorative justice. Within 1 year of introducing wisdom circles like this, where you talk through your problems, where you foster empathy and seek to repair community relationships, we saw a reduction in suspensions and expulsions by 87%. More than that, we saw complete elimination of violence. 100% of incidents of violence, fights, and bullying, for example, disappeared within 1 year of having a restorative justice program, a space where students could come together and share their experiences with violence in ways that fostered empathy and connection. The success of that program in 2007 led restorative justice to be implemented in schools across our urban district. At this point, 10 years later, we have one of the most established and successful restorative justice programs in the nation. And this is a really crucial thing, I believe, for us to keep in mind when we're thinking about what does it mean to build peace, not just within a school, in terms of school climate, or a community, in terms of the people in this room, or the city of Bogota, for example, but if we're trying to look at it on a national level or a global level. So we need to think about the ways in which we're spending our money and our resources. In the United States, it costs $60,000 to keep somebody in prison and just $10,000 to educate them. Right now in the United States, we have 25% of the world's prisoners, and the vast majority of those prisoners are poor, poorly educated, and from communities like mine, communities that have survived incredible trauma. Often those people who are in prison were the same people who were suspended or expelled from their school systems. In fact, almost 70% of prisoners in the United States do not have a high school education. So to me, what restorative justice offers is not only a way to heal relationships within a school, to create peace among students, but it also allows us as a society to really be thoughtful about where it is that we're spending our money and how we want to use that money to create a new path forward. As I said at the beginning of my talk, none of us have known peace. In many respects, it's something we're trying to build. So why would we want to adopt some of the methods and approaches that have caused such grave harm to our communities such as policing and detention? What if we could look to a practice such as restorative justice, which is actually an ancestral practice? It's based in Native American traditions of coming together in a circle to repair harm and rebuild connections between a community. What if we could look to our past to find a solution to our present? What if we could look to our past to also guide us to create something different, perhaps innovate something that we have never seen? I'm gonna be real quick now, and I apologize for that. What I've been working on for the last year is actually a way of bringing trauma-informed education to people who wish to form a business. And basically, what I'm doing is creating a curriculum for people to design a business. This, what looks like art, is actually a form of business development. It helps people create a business that actually attends to the reality that climate change is real. As I speak to you, the Caribbean is literally being remapped by climate change. What if we could find a way of building businesses that actually healed our communities, that were based in love, a connection to our ancestors, our connection to other people, but also the connection to a loving future? I'm gonna stop there because I am out of time. And thank you so much.
Muy bien, Darshan Elena, tenemos 2 preguntas que nuestro público ha hecho a través de nuestra app. La primera de ellas es: en nuestro país hay muchos sujetos que han pasado por situaciones traumáticas. Sujetos son personas, hombres colombianos que han pasado por situaciones traumáticas. ¿Cuál sería la ruta metodológica para un maestro?
Well, one, there isn't just one route, and there can't just be one method. But I think what there can be, when we're trying to think about what our teachers need to do, is we need to understand who our children are, who our learners are, and what is their context. And we also need to understand what is their community experience. And we need to think about what are our community solutions to the traumas that we face, to the experience that we face. And how can we bring that kind of learning, that kind of approach into our classroom as we're teaching about math, as we're teaching about science, as we're teaching about language? For me, really is just being very attentive to how is trauma manifesting in your classes? What does that look like? For some of us, it is a child's silence. For other people, it's rage, it's anger. If we can start figuring out the ways in which trauma expresses itself individually and collectively, we can then think about how do we develop a methodology that works for us in our context.
Y la siguiente pregunta es: ¿cuál es la mejor manera de implementar las experiencias de sanación en el posconflicto?
I wouldn't say that there is a best way of implementing healing within a community context. But what I would say is that you attend to what the community is, has been, and what they want to be. You're as localized as you possibly can be. There cannot be one solution moving forward because we are so very diverse, both in our personal experiences and in our community experiences, and then in national experiences, such as Colombia, or in my case, the United States. There cannot be a best way. There can be better practices, and those are the practices that we need to share with one another. And indeed, I think that is why we need to think about how do we build connections between our learners, but also how do we build connections between our teachers? What does it mean to create a community of teachers in a school? How do they connect to one another? Because ultimately, they're working with the same students and the same families and the same histories. So if we can connect to what the community's needs and dreams are, what their goals and realities are, that will give us an insight into what is the best route. Ultimately, we don't know what the path to peace looks like. But hopefully, in listening to each other, innovating together, sharing our stories and our successes, we can actually figure out what that's going to be. I wish Colombia, all of you, the best. I hope more than anything that you can be a model for peace at this time when war is more alive than it has ever been on our planet. Thank you.
Gracias a Darshan Elena por estas palabras y ese mensaje que nos acaba de dar. Muy bien, las problemáticas sociales, el conflicto y las diferentes formas de violencia que todavía persisten en nuestro país, pues nos han llevado a buscar estrategias que permitan construir una nación en plena armonía. Es en este contexto en el que las escuelas, especialmente en las que están en la ruralidad, pues deben consolidarse como verdaderos escenarios de paz, tal y como lo mencionó hace un momento también la doctora Campos. Entonces la pregunta es, ¿cuál es el nuevo rol que deben asumir estas instituciones educativas? Con esta pregunta vamos a dar inicio a nuestro tercer debate del día. En esta oportunidad, bajo la dirección de Rafael Orduz, el exgerente de la Fundación Compartir. Quiero invitar entonces a nuestros panelistas para que por favor se acerquen. Vicky Colbert, directora de la Fundación Escuela Nueva. Matías Rust, codirector de Respira en Educación. Darshan Elena Campos, especialista en educación de Fulbright. Karen Labrador, directora de Colombia Líder. Le cedo entonces la palabra a Rafael Orduz. Recuerden que ustedes pueden hacer sus preguntas a través de nuestra app, que serán resueltas en tiempo real por nuestros panelistas. Entonces, Rafael, muy buenas tardes, bienvenido. Adelante, lo escuchamos.